The deprogrammers were making comparisons with Hitler, and I said, I don't care if is like Hitler. I've chosen to follow him, and I'll follow him to the end. This was me just before being recruited into the Moonies.
Look at that. Stephen Hassan is a counsellor, cult expert, and former cult member. We went to talk to him about his experience.
My name is Steve Hassan. I'm a licensed mental health counselor, and I am an author of 3 books about cults, the most famous of which is Combating Cult Mind Control. I got interested in this whole subject after my family deprogrammed me from a 2.5-year involvement with cult in the early 70s. The worldview of a member of the was very us versus them. We are the chosen. We are the elite. We're going to take over the world. Only will be spoken. All other religions will be abolished.
When and why did you join?
So I was 19. I was going to graduate. I was going to be a poetry writer. But my girlfriend dumped me, and I was lonely. 3 women were flirted with me. And I remember asking at one point, are you part of some religious group? And they said, oh, no, not at all. And they invited me over for dinner, and they're like, hey, we're going away for the weekend. It's going to be so cool. You need to come. And I was very naive and trusting. And everyone was smiling and sincere and warm. And I was just like not getting that this was a cult. This is how they operate.
What was your life like when you were with?
A lot of recruiting or fundraising or political actionizing. Those were the 3 major roles. They would say you have to look 3 inches into people's eyes like this. Hi there. How are you?
Stop.
Right. I was there for 2.5 years, but I was made a leader, and that was part of the allure, I guess.
So when and what was the turning point that led to you leaving the cult?
So my last job in the cult was as a fundraising captain in Baltimore, and we were selling flowers on street corners. Everyone on my team had to make a minimum of $100 a day. Otherwise, they couldn't sleep at night. I would never ask of my members what I wouldn't do myself. So while I was sleeping 3 to 4 hours a night normally, now I was not sleeping at all. And it lasted 3 days, and I fell asleep at the wheel of a van, woke up as I was driving into the back of a tractor-trailer truck at 80 miles an hour or so. That accident put me away from the group for a few weeks, sleeping, eating, away from the constant indoctrination, which led to me reaching out to my sister, who was the only person who hadn't said I was in a cult and I was brainwashed. So she lured me to her house, basically did tell my parents, who had been wanting to find me to help me.
So it was actually the near-fatal accident that saved your life in the end?
Yeah.
Have you been in contact with anyone since the day you left?
So as soon as I woke up, I wanted to get all the people I recruited out, obviously. Naturally, I felt ashamed and embarrassed and guilty. And I reached out to them all, but nobody wants to talk to me. I think it's too raw.
What was it like to reintegrate back into wider society?
It took me months to admit I was in a cult and speak out publicly. It took me a year before I could kiss a woman and not have the indoctrination in my head. It was very traumatic.
Is there such a thing as a benign cult?
Definitely. Yeah, of course. I believe there are positive religions, and that spiritual experience is a great thing if people know what they're getting into, if people are free to leave, if people are allowed to read whatever they want to read and talk to whoever they want to.
What do we get wrong about people who've joined cults?
Nobody joins a cult to deceptively recruited. Citizen of the world looks at someone in a cult and says there's something wrong with them. They're weak, they're stupid, they're this, they're that, instead of going, wow, there was a very systematic mind control regime that was implemented on them, and they just didn't understand what was happening to them, so they got programmed.
What techniques do cults use to recruit and influence followers?
They use deceptive recruitment, so people don't know what is happening to them. Thought-stopping, loaded language, totalist black and white ideology, those are the universal techniques.
As someone who's been in a group that's been called a cult, how do you help people in those same situations?
My influence campaign is oriented to empowering people to think for themselves and give them information to reality test so that they can actually make a choice. I can tell you what you shouldn't do is say, you're in a cult, and try to argue the person rationally out of it, because they've already been programmed to expect persecution from people who are ignorant. What it isn't is a quick fix. I'm very grateful that I was rescued by my family, and I wish everybody had family who cared as much as mine and had the means to be able to help, and most people don't.
Who is the person that's most susceptible to this? Because, I mean, I think like my theory is that if you've already are in deep on some type of fundamentalist religion, making that shift over to Q or into some deep spiritual, it doesn't necessarily have to be a, organized religion, your mode of thought is open to that.
It is huge. The overlap between evangelical Christianity and especially Pentecostalism and Q-anon is huge from what I've seen. I mean, when I go to these Q-anon events, they'll do these, very charismatic religious things. They'll do the altar calls. People will do speaking in tongues. And I think, an aspect of that is this idea of modern day apostles or prophets. So you have these people who say, well, my prophecy is that Donald Trump will be elected in 2016 or these various things. And so if you already buy into that, it doesn't seem like that big a leap for a lot of these people to then say, well, maybe there is this Q guy who is, sort of telling me about the secret war with the devil. Initially, people getting into Q-anon tended to be kind of like a Trump rally crowd, older, whiter, because it was so focused on Trump. But especially with the pandemic, when people got, more people were sort of looking for answers and they had a lot more time online, we start seeing it sort of spread out into younger people, more people of color, more women. So really, at this point, it's often someone who maybe already has something a little weird going on with them, and then they hear about QAnon and then they get all in.
There's the Satanism is fascinating too, because I also think you can connect it to how there's the demonization of trans people right now. There are demons among us. They're trying to go after your kids, make them trans, make them gay. And there's this kind of artificial morality ascribed to like a mission and into belief against fact that you can also tie into, Jesus is coming any day now. Not to make this like a anti-religion thing, but when you go far down that rabbit hole, it's the search for signs. And they've just kind of copy and pasted that onto Donald Trump as the savior in this instance.
Yeah, I mean, they really see that it's so key to the QAnon belief system, and really like religion, like we've been talking about, is just right next to that. I mean, you hear people who get into QAnon because of their religion, or people who are brought to Christianity by QAnon, who are not in a church, and then they start hearing so much about the devil and Jesus and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, it's so key to the QAnon belief system that like the devil is a real guy, a real force, and he's out there in the world, and he has these agents, and it's your job as a QAnon believer and as a Christian to, you are on the front lines, you are fighting here. You're absolutely right. I mean, I think QAnon has played a significant role in the trans panic and this backlash to LGBT rights, to say that, this idea that they're after the children, I think fits right into that.
What is fundamentalism? Broadly construed, fundamentalism refers to a strict adherence to traditional or orthodox religious beliefs, or, by extension, a dogmatic belief in an unchanging political or other credo. As we can see, fundamentalism, therefore, is normally viewed as a type of conservative religious movement, characterized by the advocacy of strict conformity to sacred texts. The term fundamentalism derives from the Protestant theological tradition, where it refers to an unalterable belief in the literal truth of the Scripture and the creeds. However, it was applied more broadly to a wide variety of religious movements during the late 20th century. In fact, many of the major religions in the world today can be said to have fundamentalist movements. A concrete example to this is Christian fundamentalism, a movement in American Protestantism that arose in the late 19th century in reaction to theological modernism, which aimed to revise traditional Christian beliefs to accommodate new developments in natural and social sciences, especially the theory of biological evolution. The equivalent French term, intégrisme, describes the doctrines of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, and others who rejected, and still reject, the reforms instituted by the Second Vatican Council of 1962 to 1965. Since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which sought to establish a theocratic regime based upon Islamic law, or Sharia, it has become commonplace to speak of Islamic fundamentalism, or intégrisme islamique, rather as though Islamic theology and history were simply variants on the Western model. The closest Arabic equivalent is Salafiyya, which can be rendered as Salafism, which is a generic term implying a call for a return to the values of the Quran, and for following the example of pious epigones, or Salaf. It is interesting to note that some religious leaders view fundamentalism negatively. For example, Pope Francis said that fundamentalism is a sickness that is in all religions. Religious fundamentalism is not religious, because it lacks God. It is idolatry, like idolatry of money. We Catholics have some, and not some, many, who believe in the absolute truth and go ahead dirtying the other with calumny, with disinformation, and doing evil.
Hey guys, Pastor Tanner here. 3 signs that you're a fundamentalist or you're talking with one. Now before we jump into the 3 signs, I just have a few preliminary words. First, according to the historical definition of the term, I am a fundamentalist. A fundamentalist used to just be somebody who adheres to the fundamentals of the faith. That would be me. However, in our current day and age, the term fundamentalist has taken on new shades and nuances of meaning. Nowadays, it means somebody who tenaciously holds to their position, believing they're always right, and is not open to engaging with somebody else in dialogue. It's in this newer sense that I am using the term fundamentalist in this video. That said, I don't care much for semantics, so if you consider yourself a fundamentalist and want to use it in its older sense, be my guest. My attack doesn't apply to you. However, I also want to point out this. Fundamentalists come in many shapes and sizes. There are Christian Baptist fundamentalists. I've met Presbyterian fundamentalists. I've also met atheist fundamentalists and Jewish fundamentalists. I have a problem with fundamentalism across the board. I'm an equal opportunity hater when it comes to fundamentalism. All right, without further ado, let's jump into the 3 signs that you're a fundamentalist or you're talking with one. The first sign that you're dealing with a fundamentalist is that a disagreement with them is equivalent to a disagreement with God or with the scriptures or with science or with whatever their authority is. You see, a fundamentalist fails to recognize that they are interpreting things through a grid or a framework. Instead, they think they are perceiving the facts and the evidence as they are on the surface without having any interpretive framework. But as James White has said, those who are blind to their traditions are a slave to their traditions. All of us bring an interpretive framework to the scriptures, and we understand them in a certain way. A fundamentalist thinks that whatever they read in the scriptures is actually self-evident on the text itself. So if you disagree with their interpretation, then you're disagreeing with the Bible. After all, they don't have an interpretation, they don't have a tradition, they're just telling you what the scriptures say. And if they disagree with you, then bad for you. I encountered this particular error of fundamentalism when I was first engaging with a friend of mine. And we were talking about the issue of believer's baptism versus infant baptism. And I was noting the fact that while I believe in believer's baptism, that those who believe in infant baptism have good arguments for what they believe also. The individual said this, well, don't we just need to teach them what the Bible says? That is a perfect example of a fundamentalistic mindset. They think that the Bible self-evidently teaches the Baptist position, and if you disagree with them on the issue of baptism, you're simply disagreeing with the Bible. They fail to understand their interpretive framework or lens. They fail to understand how their tradition is causing them to read the scriptures in a certain way. This is one aspect of fundamentalism. The second way you know you're dealing with a fundamentalist is that they fail to recognize nuance and tension within the text. Now don't get me wrong, I believe the scriptures are clear, and we have good understandings from the Bible of how Christians are supposed to live their lives. However, somebody who is of a fundamentalistic mindset fails to recognize that the scriptures give this clarity to us in a variety of ways. I'll give an example of this. I was preaching a sermon out of Ecclesiastes, and in that sermon, I said we are supposed to be obedient to governments and those who rule and are in authority. I cross-referenced at this point Romans 13. On their way out the door, somebody approached me and said, yeah, but don't the scriptures say that we are to obey God rather than men? Why are you telling us to be obedient to governments and those in authority? And this is the failure of the fundamentalists. They can't reconcile two things that are in tension. The Bible both teaches that we are to be obedient to governments and those who are in authority, and that we are to obey God rather than men. The Christian endeavor is how to put these ideas together. The fundamentalist fails to do that, however. The scriptures are black and white. They clearly teach we are to obey God rather than men, and so we're not going to be obedient to governments and those in authority. The third way that you know you're dealing with a fundamentalist is that they fail to distinguish between primary, secondary, and tertiary levels of doctrine. What do I mean by this? Well, in Christian understanding, we recognize that there are certain doctrines that are at the core of what we believe, God and the gospel. However, we also recognize that there are other doctrines that, while important, we may have disagreements on them. Eschatology, for example. Some may be pre-trib, post-trib, some may be amillennial, but we recognize that this is not a primary level of doctrine. A fundamentalist fails to differentiate between levels of doctrine. For them, all doctrines are primary. I was listening to one pastor and preacher, and he actually called out this issue of eschatology as a primary issue. He said, if people don't agree with our doctrine, they're heretics. And he followed up with this. He said, bunch of mid-trib, bunch of post-trib, bunch of false doctrine. That's what he said. Not only that, he said, I don't know if some of you Calvinists have crept up in here, but I want you to know that Calvinism is as false doctrine as ordaining a woman preacher is. You can see his point. Any disagreement with him on any point of doctrine is a disagreement with all of the doctrine. There are no such things as primary, secondary, and tertiary levels of doctrine. This is a fundamentalistic mindset. So there are my three ways you know you're talking with a fundamentalist or you're a fundamentalist yourself. The reason I'm doing this video is I think that fundamentalism of this sort is not good for Christianity in our current day and age. Now when I say that, please don't hear me saying that I don't think doctrine and theology is important. It is absolutely essential. However, in an internet age, we need to be more conversant with other positions rather than less conversant. And the way we do this is through being open-minded and having good discussions. Instead, I would like to advance a position that I hold for myself. And this position I call open but uncompromised. Open but uncompromised tries to grab the tension between not caving to political pressures on the one hand, but also being open to recognize other people have different interpretations than me. I truly struggle with fundamentalists of all stripes, and I think the open but uncompromised position is the path forward for the church today in our internet age. So remember to hold to your positions in an open but uncompromised way.
According to a new scientific study published in the journal Neuropsychology, there is a link that scientists have now confirmed between damage to a person's prefrontal cortex and religious fundamentalism. Scientists who went back and looked at CT scans of Vietnam veterans who had had some form of damage to their prefrontal cortex and then gave them tests to assess their religiosity found that there is a direct link between brain damage and religious fundamentalism. Now, here's the thing. This is what they explain throughout this study. I encourage everyone to go read this. This is absolutely fascinating. But the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that helps control creativity, open-mindedness, curiosity, the things that actually make us question what we see, what we hear, what we know. When there is damage to that, it hinders that particular ability. So people do not question. They accept something for what it is. And now with religious fundamentalism, those things are not based in logic and reason already. And they have found that people who are fundamentally religious do not question those beliefs at all, ever. And now they believe they may have found out why. And there's many things that can cause damage to a person's prefrontal cortex. Drug abuse, alcohol abuse, blunt trauma, PTSD, things like that, all of them, and many more can damage this part of the brain. It's very delicate. And here's where we are. And this study is important because in too many parts of the world, including parts of America here, religious fundamentalism reigns supreme. And I'm not just talking about the average person who says, yes, I believe in God and I go to church every Sunday, sometimes every Wednesday. That's not who these people were looking at. They are looking at the people who live their life according to a document that they believe was written by God himself or his prophets. Those people who believe that every word in that book is 100% true and they live their life by it. And furthermore, they want to force it upon everyone else as well. This is not your average, everyday religious person. These are the people you see screaming at other people on the street corners while holding up a Bible. That's the kind of people that have this affliction. And that's what scientists were trying to determine. Is this just who they are? Or is there a psychological, neurological reason that they behave this way? And they believe that they have found the link. So the next time you see somebody standing on the street corner screaming at you to live your life by the Bible, those may actually be cries for help because this person is not mentally stable, at least according to the available research. They need help. And this is a problem that has to be addressed. Scientists are discovering more and more. This is not the first study that has linked brain damage to religious fundamentalism in the last 12 months. And I don't believe that it's going to be the last one that we see of this. The link is becoming clearer and clearer. These people need help, and scientists are doing what they can to help them. But at the same time, and
and I cannot stress this enough, this is not an attack on religion. This is not an attack on the way anybody lives their lives. What you do in private is fine. You want to go to church, go to church. Believe in God. I don't care. It doesn't bother me or affect me either way. But it's when you come out and you try to impose your beliefs on another human being and you refuse to question anything about those beliefs, that's when it becomes a problem. That's when it goes to full-blown religious fundamentalism, and that right now is what scientists are trying to fix.
The frontal cortex is arguably the most human part of the brain. Proportionately, we've got more complex frontal cortices than any other species out there. It's the most recently evolved part of the brain. Frontal cortex, a big-time frontal cortex, is virtually a primate invention. We're humans really running with it. What does the frontal cortex do? All sorts of complicated things, regulating executive behaviors and strategizing on the very simplest level. What does the frontal cortex do? It makes you do the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. It makes you do something that's difficult when that's what you should be doing. The frontal cortex, okay, you want some terrible, utterly inapplicable metaphor. Frontal cortex is the nearest thing we've got to a superego, the nearest thing to a part of the brain saying, I wouldn't do that if I were you. You were going to regret it. The frontal cortex has this role manifest in all sorts of domains. For example, the frontal cortex makes you at a party do the right thing even though it's harder. You've just been served the most horrendous meal you can ever imagine, and it's your frontal cortex that kicks in that says, whoa, this is delicious, I've got to have the recipe. The frontal cortex is what gets you to compliment somebody's hideous new hairdo. The frontal cortex keeps you from being a serial murderer. It keeps you constrained. It keeps you in line. The frontal cortex is also something that kicks in a very dramatic way during early development. Most of us way back when had to suddenly get a lot of frontal function when we learned to be toilet trained. And that is something that soon moved from frontal executive control to implicit pathways. Most of us don't have to think consciously anymore about being toilet trained, but early on, that was one of the big initial frontal tasks that we had to master. Okay, so frontal cortex, all sorts of fascinating other features of it. And as just became clear, part of development, child development, is your frontal cortex maturing. And you can show the fact that kids don't have a whole lot in the way of a frontal cortex by brain imaging, things of that sort, and you find out something absolutely astonishing. The frontal cortex is the last part of the brain to fully develop. Your frontal cortex is not fully developed until around age 25. That is astonishing. That explains an awful lot of behavior in freshman dorms. That explains all sorts of things. The frontal cortex takes forever to develop. And thus, childhood is filled with a frontal cortex that doesn't work very well yet. You can show this wonderful study, this wonderful experimental paradigm, where you take kids, and what you do is you put the child in a room, and you put a marshmallow in front of them, and you say, okay, here's the deal. I'm going out of the room. I'm going to come back in a while, and if you want, while I'm out of the room, you can have that marshmallow. On the other hand, if you don't eat it, when I come back, you can have 2 marshmallows. In other words, can you regulate your behavior, regulate this impulsive desire to grab that marshmallow? And kids very early on are awfully challenged in order to hold on and not grab the marshmallow early on. And in fact, there's a literature by now showing you take like 4-year-olds, and the longer they can hold on not taking the marshmallow, the more frontal regulation they have of their behavior. And that is in part predictive of things like SAT scores a decade later in high school. This is the mark of a frontal cortex that is developing in a very impressive manner.
In psychology, the dark triad represents 3 personality traits: narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. If we were to ask the 3 who has the darkest personality, the narcissist would say, me. The psychopath would say, I don't care. And the Machiavellian would say, it's whoever I want it to be. People scoring high on the 3 traits are more likely to commit crimes and create severe social problems in society, families, and organizations. This is why the research on the dark triad is used widely in law enforcement, psychology, and business. Here is an overview of what we know. The narcissist displays grandiosity, entitlement, and superiority, and wants nothing more than admiration. Once he gets what he wants, the narcissist is rarely interested in other people. When he does care, it's to enhance his status, which is why he likes to mingle with successful others. They seem as though they're completely in love with themselves, but at the root of their inflated egos are often deeply held feelings of inferiority. To protect their constructed self, they can never admit to being wrong, which is why they lie or blame others. Machiavellians are unprincipled, cold, and have a cynical view of other human beings. They like money, power, and winning, and they use manipulation to get what they want or exploit others. If manipulation doesn't work, they steal or betray. Those high on the spectrum believe it's better to be feared than being liked and defend others as a strategy to control them. When you are a psychopath, you come across as cold, and others think you are scary. You also show little to no fear, act impulsively, and you enjoy mental thrills. Those high on the spectrum don't form any emotional bonds. The result is a complete lack of compassion. That means they have no problem being mean. If something terrible happens, they later often don't feel any remorse or guilt. The research tells us that men score significantly higher on all 3 compared to women. And while these 3 personalities are empirically distinct, they do overlap. Clinically, both narcissism and psychopathy are regarded as mental disorders, while Machiavellianism isn't. Whether nature or nurture is responsible for these traits has been somewhat answered by twin studies that show that narcissism and psychopathy have substantial genetic components. Machiavellianism seems to be less prevalent in pairs of twins. However, the environment also matters. A psychopath may not only pass down his genes, but influence a child by being a role model. A Machiavellian father shares with his son not only genetic material, but might also show him all his tricks. The son of a narcissist not only gets his dad's chromosomes, but may also experience his perfectionism. With the big 5 personality traits, also known as Ocean, the 3 correlate either positively or negatively. Narcissists and psychopaths are often open to new ideas and extroverted. Psychopaths and Machiavellians have low conscientiousness. All 3 personality types score low on agreeableness, and psychopaths are hardly neurotic. Whatever happens leaves them cold. An evolutionary explanation for these traits could be sexual strategy. Many of us pursue a slow life, invest in long-term relationships, have a few children, and spend time on parenting. Dark Triad traits may have survived because they look to optimize a fast life. Their ancestors lived in an unpredictable and dangerous world. Because of a shorter life, they sought many sexual partners, spent no time on parenting, and did not invest in human relationships. This may also explain why they strive in competitive environments, such as corporations. Here, a Machiavellian may use charm and insults to manipulate others. The narcissist, his physical appearance, and a psychopath, physical threats. And since they all lack compassion, they often elbow their way to the top, which is maybe why all 3 dark traits are well represented in upper-level management. But there are also downsides. If your mind was programmed to be impulsive, aggressive, and selfish, you are also more likely to abuse drugs, feel excluded, suffer from depression, or end up in jail. This is why we may not only find ways to protect ourselves from these darker minds, but also have empathy for them. After all, maybe they didn't choose to be that way. What about you? Did you inherit some dark triad traits? And if that's the case, and if you are aware of them, did you develop strategies to cope with them? Share your thoughts in the comments below and read the description to dig deeper and find relevant links, sources, and information. This and all other Sprouts videos are licensed under Creative Commons. That means teachers from all around the world can use them in classrooms, online courses, or to start projects. And today, thousands already do. To learn how it works and download this video without ads or background music, check out our website or read the description below. If you want to support our mission and help change education, visit our Patreon. That's patreon.com/sprouts.